Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar where we'll be exploring the key discussions and announcements from this week's Labour Party conference and what they mean for the housing sector. And if they're anything like me, we'll be joined by a slightly croaky panel, fresh from a week at conference, or not so fresh from a week at conference, very shortly. But before I introduce our fantastic panelists today, a bit of background to set the scene for the discussion ahead. Over the last 4 days, MPs, councillors, charities, funders and housing providers, to name a few, have taken part in numerous debates and discussions on the fringe session of the Labour Party conference and on the main floor. For me, one of the key takeaways has been just how many of the new intake of MPs have a specific interest in housing, with a number having either worked in the sector or been personally affected by housing issues. There were numerous mentions at various sessions across the week of how key members of the cabinet, such as Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting, grew up in social housing. That was kind of continually emphasised. It feels like a real opportunity for the sector, and I'll be keen to chat to our panellists later about that. Certainly when I spoke about Inside Housing's Build Social campaign at the Labour Housing Group's Fringe on Sunday, what was striking was how many MPs who were speaking at that session, well, how many MPs did speak at that session, and how many of them had a similar desire to see the delivery of more homes for social rent. Inside Housing also chaired a fascinating session on Monday about the future funding of housing delivery and the type of partnerships that are likely to emerge as a result. On the day that Emma Reynolds, the Minister for Pensions, announced a new partnership between Nest, L&G and Dutch pension fund service provider PGGM. She flagged the partnership as an example of the opportunities provided by the government's pension review. So lots of kind of conversations about what that delivery might look like and where some of the opportunities for funding might come from. And then, of course, there are a number of key announcements over the course of the week, including Sir Keir Starmer's announcement about homelessness and further commitments from ministers to things like the revamped Decent Home Standard, Awaab's Law, qualifications for housing managers, and a long-term plan for housing. So lots about quality as well in there. So yeah, huge amounts to talk about and explore more fully this afternoon. And to guide us through things, I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel who are all up at conference this week to talk through their experiences and learning. We'll be hearing from Jasmine Basran, Head of Policy and Campaigns with Crisis, James McLaren, Head of External Affairs with Sovereign Network Group, Lucy Dixon, Head of External Affairs with Carbon Homes, and Priya Nair, Chief Executives of the Housing Finance Corporation. So yeah, welcome all. Great to see you here today. And before I hand over to Jasmine for her opening thoughts, just a reminder that this is your opportunity to ask the questions that are going to help inform your own decision making moving forwards and get your answers about what happened at conference this week as well. So please do ask your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and I'll get to as many as possible following the opening thoughts and statements. And before I start, just I should also state that actually this event and the events of this week just start of a programme of work focused on opportunities and delivery by Inside Housing over the coming months. On the 4th November, my colleague Sarah Paling will be leading the inaugural Homes England Investment Symposium, and that's to be followed by the Inside Housing Build More Homes Summit. So please go check those out and hopefully see a few of you there as well. But anyway, that is plenty from me, more than enough from me. Jasmine, welcome. How was your conference? And over to you for some opening thoughts.
Thanks so much, Martin. And thank you for the invite to be here. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to reflect. I'm definitely a little bit worse for wear, but largely because Crisis, we're a national homelessness charity, for those of you who might not know us, and we operate across England, Scotland and Wales, both in terms of delivering policy, research and campaigning around the changes we feel are needed to end homelessness, but also delivering frontline services to thousands of people across Great Britain. We were fortunate enough to have a stand at party conference at Labour, and what that meant was we were able to interact with a huge number of ministers, MPs, councillors and conference attendees. And I'll touch on in a moment some of the fringe events we went to, but just I wanted to open by talking about those interactions, because actually I've been going to conference for the past 8 years. And I have to say that this was definitely a conference where there was so much optimism, hope and focus around housing and homelessness. And I think the important shift for us and the really exciting shift that I saw at this Labour Party conference is that people are really seeing homelessness and housing as part of the same issue and the same solution. So as a national charity, we've spent a number of years trying to really explain and put forward the solutions to homelessness being significant increase in social housing. And actually, it didn't feel like we were having to make that argument. It might be skewed because, you know, people were coming over to us already interested in homelessness, but it was a really positive kind of interactions we had time and again, and people kind of skipping that part where we talk about why homelessness matters, why it needs to be a priority, and much more focused on the solutions. So it left me feeling quite emboldened, actually, and thinking we have a really constructive kind of front bench in government at the moment around this issue, and also lots of MPs who are very, very willing to get involved. We also provide the secretariat for the AEPPG for Ending Homelessness, which is a cross-party group of MPs and politicians. So it includes peers who are interested in ending homelessness. And so we had lots of those MPs come over. We recruited more MPs as well, because so many people actually want to kind of see how they can drive this forward in Parliament. Just a quick reflection on the fringes. Our team and myself were able to go to a number of fringes, and housing really, really is the priority. As you might expect, we prioritise the tending ones around social housing. And I think the emerging discussion, which Martin touched on, which is really fascinating, is around how we deliver the social homes that we need. Crisis believes this needs to reach 90,000 per year due to some modelling and research we've done with the National Housing Federation and Heriot Watt University, and there is consensus around this number. It's also backed by the Build Social Housing campaign. And so there's a really fascinating discussion at the moment of how we get there. And I think here's where there's some potentially emerging groupings around what that solution can look like and where that should sit. But what I strongly felt was certainly from the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, from Angela Rayner, in her role as Secretary of State and Deputy Prime Minister, they see social housing delivery as a fundamental part of the housing crisis and also a driver of that. And so putting social housing delivery front and centre is something very new to us. We did have that in Michael Gove as Secretary of State, but even with some of the announcements around right to buy, it feels like we are starting to have a serious conversation around what Treasury backing could look like in this space. So we're really, really excited to be engaging in this, and we think there's a lot more fruitful discussion to be had. I'll leave it there because I don't want to take up all time, but really looking forward to this discussion today.
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah, wow, so much to kind of pick up on there from that kind of enthusiasm and what that might mean, because I think that's also quite significant through to that delivery of the 90,000 homes a year. And yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know that kind of session that we were on at Labour Housing Group right at the start of the week, absolutely that kind of statement of intent, yes, but also actually MP after MP talking about that as something they want to see delivered, and also it being something that can be delivered as well, which I think is important to state. So yeah, thanks, lots to pick up on there. Thanks very much, Jasmine, very much appreciated for some opening thoughts. James, welcome, and over to you for your opening thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am slightly awed to be amongst such a great panel, but I'll try to give you some idea of what we saw. In case you hadn't heard of SNG, I mean, we're relatively new, being formed out of the former Sovereign and former Network, but we are the second largest builder amongst housing associations, according to Inside Housing's Biggest Builders Survey, which is, of course, the authoritative place you will find that piece of information, and we're the largest with the growing pipeline. Slightly unusually amongst the sector at the moment, we are in a position where we are accelerating our delivery, and as Jasmine said, the key point actually came up a lot throughout the conference was delivery, and we do have very ambitious plans to build 25,000 homes over the next 10 years, and we are growing. I'm going to probably focus less on policy, because you can read the roundup on the Inside Housing website from the policy announcements, but I will try and give you a bit of a sense of kind of the feel of conference and some of the conversations that we were hearing and we were seeing when we were there, and the mood. I mean, firstly, it was pretty wet. Those of us are there, well done if you didn't get soaked at some point. I certainly did more than once. But actually, the mood, despite we reading the papers, was very positive, and particularly around housing. It was hugely busy. I think 20,000 passes were issued, and you could certainly feel that throughout all the rooms. And there was a lot of positive energy around the conference, and particularly around housing. As Jasmine said before, housing was the big issue at the conference. I've never seen that before in the 10 years I've worked in housing. It was really the critical thing that everyone was talking about, and a joke that was running around the conference was that it was a housing conference with a political party attached. And if you went to the fringe meetings, a lot of them were heavily weighted towards housing. So well done to anyone who managed to squeeze into the New Statesman's panel, although of course it meant that you missed our fantastic panel on partnerships, which is happening at the same time, and Lucy's fantastic panel, I'm sure, on with the NatFed, which was also happening at the same time, which gives you some sense of the scheduling challenges that they were finding with the number of housing fringes that were going on. So if I went through all the issues that were discussed through the panels that certainly I and our team went to, I mean, we would be here all day, and you don't need to hear that much from me. But there are some sort of key themes that came out of the ones that I certainly went to. And firstly, money was just kept coming up again and again and again. And I know Jasmine mentioned conversations with the Treasury, and the Treasury starting to get it. But there were a lot of conversations about the issue of the sector just not having enough capital to be able to deliver, which I think we all know and we can all feel. So it's interesting that kept coming up. And I know that Priya will cover innovative funding methods later, so I won't try and steal her thunder on that, because I would do a terrible job of it. Placemaking was certainly a thing alongside sustainability and quality, the sense that as we deliver, we want to deliver quality and sustainable homes as well as delivering big. That was a big sort of topic of conversation. And also changing attitudes to development, which is certainly reflected in the planning reforms. So, I mean, where are we with the government and Labour MPs? Housing is clearly a priority of the government. But ahead of the budget, ministers, in my experience, and I'd be interested to hear from others, but certainly ministers that we were talking to were quite tight-lipped and stuck very much to the lines that we've been getting before. They didn't want to give too much away. More interestingly, for the new generation of Labour MPs, I had a lot of them speaking quite movingly about their own experience of the housing crisis and what it meant to them and their families and their friends. And they were speaking about actually how the housing crisis affected them, which I think is an interesting point, which we've not seen before. And the housing is a critical issue in MPs' inboxes. Certainly locally, we've found that. For the local authority leaders and councillors, housing is very much top of mind as well. Housing targets and delivery were a big topic of conversation, how they're going to deliver in their local areas. And particularly for us as a big developing association, there was a lot of positivity around the issue of partnerships, which we're very, very open to deliver. And actually, there was a bit of work to do to remind some people that the 10-year rent settlement isn't sorted yet, despite what you might have read in some papers, and that we need to keep banging the drum to make that a reality, because as at the other Inside Housing session with the Janet Rowntree Foundation, the leader of Southwark gave a very full-throated defence of a 10-year CPI above inflation rent settlement, because essentially that is what we need, and we would very much agree with that. And there was a lot of discussion around that. So it was a very positive conference from a housing perspective, and I think the thing is, we as a sector now need to find a way to make that continue. We're a long-term sector, so we need to have that continue over generations, not just one conference. But I would say, from a housing perspective, it was very positive.
Thanks so much, James. Yeah, huge amounts to think about there. That housing conference with a political conference attached. Can't stress how much it did feel like that at times. James talked about those kind of clashes of sessions, but it was back to back pretty much throughout the week. There were housing sessions that were well attended the whole time. I mean, I was at a session with James, which was pretty much you were fighting to get in the room. It was really interesting to see, and I think a contrast certainly to some of the previous conferences I've been at. I mean, it's always been a reasonably big feature of Labour, but much more so this year, I think. We'll come back and reflect on some of that shortly. Thanks, James, and Lucy. Welcome, and over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Hopefully, I'm not going to duplicate too much of what James said, although I think sounds like we had similar experiences, but hopefully I'll be able to add a little bit more as well. I'm Lucy Dixon. I'm head of external affairs at Carbon Homes. We're a housing association based across the northeastern Yorkshire. We have about 34,000 homes. So for those of you who don't know about us, again, like James, I'll focus on mood. I think overall the mood was very positive, perhaps not as celebratory as you might expect for a government that has just come into power for the first time in 14 years. There was certainly among ministers, I think, an air of caution. And as James referred to, there was definitely some tightly disciplined messaging around spending and very much a wait and see for what the budget brings in October. But the overall kind of mood music was really positive. And as people have said before, there was a huge focus on housing, more than I've ever seen before. And every housing event I went to was standing room only. And it wasn't just packed full of housing sector people like myself or James or Martin or Jasmine. It was, council leaders, there were councillors, a lot of party activists, party members, third sectors. It is a focus for a lot of people, and that was reflected in the diverse nature of those attending and those asking questions. I think you can see the one of the ways in which you're able to see that the housing is such a big focus for the Labour Party was even in Keir's speech itself. I think one of the first achievements he referred to was the planning reforms, the first achievements of their government. He even used the analogy of rebuilding the nation kind of as a new home, rebuilding it brick by brick. And obviously he announced some key policy announcements on homelessness within that speech. And that kind of that tone was evident throughout. Attended various fringe events throughout, and had a lot of meetings with our kind of local MPs, council leaders and councillors. And everywhere we seem to have that positive messaging that housing is really important to them. They know it's important to voters. They know that's one of the reasons why people elected Labour. And if you just look at the polls recently, I think I've seen a couple of polls that show that the majority of those who voted Labour are pro-development and pro finding a kind of long-term solution to housing. Just a couple of quotes that I kind of wrote down and noted at fringe events, which I think were a reflection of where the Labour government is coming from. Andy Burnham, I think, said housing should come first in the hierarchy of public spending, really putting it right at the centre. Baroness Taylor said, this government is committed to ensuring everyone has a safe, secure and affordable home. And she reiterated how much her Secretary of State passionately cares about social housing. So you really felt that warmth, that commitment throughout all of the sessions. Being based up in the north, we're particularly interested in how devolution impacts upon the delivery of housing. So we attended a number of those sessions, and everywhere you went, Metro mayors also had housing at the heart of what they were talking about. There's a real desire, I think, among the Metro mayors to get their hands on more funding, more powers around housing, because I think they can see it as a lever for driving economic growth in their regions, which they will ultimately be judged upon and in the future. And they want to be able to direct that and take the lead on that. And that was evident, and that was really good to see. And the conversations we had with MPs, councillors and council leaders, they want to be able to show they can deliver in their areas. So again, housing is a very key way in which they can do that. And many of them were struggling with various different issues in the local authority areas that they cover. In terms of the issues that people talked about, I agree very much with James. There was a lot of talk about funding. There was a recognition, I think, that planning can only go so far. And while ministers didn't want to commit to that funding in advance of the October budget, there was a recognition that something had to change in that nature. I think there was a real understanding of the dual nature of the housing crisis, that it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. And that's net zero, but that's also about, just older homes generally and some of that refurbishment that's required. And I think having a lot of, we spoke to a lot of northern MPs and northern councils, really understanding that there are some areas that just need wholesale regeneration, and an understanding of that, whether or not that will extrapolate into funding and commitments. I think that's the key for me is, really, really good, positive commitments in a positive mood. And we can't ask for more at this stage, but I think it will be very interesting to see how far that is translated into actual funding and then to actual delivery. And I think, October the 30th is the one to watch for that coming up.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, absolutely, and really interesting. We'll pick up on this very shortly, but hearing those words from Burnham as well, just this kind of pressure coming through from various different sources, and I think one of the things I'll want to reflect on shortly is what that kind of actually means, and if the sector's looking to work, build a coalition of people, if you like, what that might look like moving forwards. Loads of questions coming in. I should say before I move to Priya for her opening thoughts, just a reminder, do use that Q&A box to ask as many questions as possible, and I'll get round hopefully a good number of them following our final opening thoughts, and that brings me nicely to Priya. So welcome, Priya, and over to you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you as well for inviting me to this session with my esteemed panelists. I suppose, from my perspective as a relatively new CEO of THFC, one of the reasons I felt it was a great time for me to join THFC was I felt this moment of change within the sector. And given this was, I guess I chose the right first party conference to attend, because there was definitely that same sense at the conference for me as well, albeit I don't have a reference point. There definitely seemed to be that renewed optimism. A couple of other observations before speaking to my sort of specific experience, to add to what my panelists mentioned. Absolutely, it felt like housing was center stage at the conference, not just in terms of the main event, but also the fringe events. I was struggling to get to everything, particularly because of the rain. As James mentioned, I will wear different shoes next time. Communication channels seem to be much improved between the sector and the government. There seemed to be that openness and dialogue. It was apparent with the standing room only, but also some of the questions and the interaction that particularly the ministers had with the audiences, which was welcome. And I think that set the tone as well in terms of that spirit of collaboration. One of the things which I was hoping would be the case, and I felt validated listening to a lot of the conversation, is to essentially elevate the importance of housing as national infrastructure. It's something which I feel particularly passionate about. I think it is central to not just driving economic growth, but so many other impactful outcomes, not least social stability. And I think that resonated throughout, particularly given it was so central to so many conversations, even if the topic or the title of the event wasn't housing itself. Someone did mention already in the panel around the questions that keep coming back was, where's the money? And it was clear, albeit wasn't said as blatantly in terms of the events I went to, that not only are the public finances quite constrained, I think there was definitely a sense of wait and see towards the budget. I agree with James. If anything, I felt that there was even more lack of clarity or fuzziness around the rent settlement point, which I think we all went in thinking perhaps there was a bit more certainty on. So there was definitely a sense that everyone was unclear where the money would come from, albeit very excited that there was this sense of importance to this topic, and also a sense of ambition to what needs to be achieved in the course of the next, call it 5 years, or even the decade of renewal, to quote Keir Starmer. I suppose I'm happy to jump into a few things, but maybe to sort of open it out, Martin, one of the things I will put down here is something I've also been saying, and we at THFC have been saying for a number of years, and throughout our 35-year tenure as a trusted operator and voice, is that the scale of need of capital and investment is such that we cannot see any other way except there being a combination of public sector funding and attracting the right kind of responsible private capital. And the theme at this conference, and a lot of the other events I've been to away from this conference as well, is that it's all about that collaboration and partnerships. So that the key here is for us to come together, and it was great to do that in this forum. But I think the work starts here in terms of what that really translates to in terms of that collaboration and public-private come together to achieve the ambitions that have been now telegraphed quite widely.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. There's a lot again that what happens next, and what does it mean in terms of partnership? I mean, lots of kind of conversations from the week, but where do they kind of go next, and what do they actually mean in terms of likely direction of travel in the sector? Loads of questions coming through. I am going to try and get through as many of your questions as possible now, and yeah, lots of variation as well, everything from sustainability to tenants' roles in the conversation, PRS, and some of those announcements around funding and homelessness. So yeah, lots to pick up on, and yeah, I mean, I think maybe let's start on those announcements about homelessness, because they were front and center in the Prime Minister's speech. Obviously, that was really what Keir Starmer chose to emphasise, particularly announcements around housing for veterans and priority for veterans and care leavers, among others. So Jasmine, I'll bring you back in first on that. So what did you make of those announcements, and did they were they helpful? Is this something you've been lobbying for? Did it feel like it was moving in the right direction? And also, I guess probably I might add to the question that came in from James. Were there any gaps? So yeah, Jasmine, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so actually one thing I should have said is I don't remember the last time we had homelessness explicitly referenced in the Prime Minister's speech at conference. So that to us is definitely a signal of priority and focus on the issue. And we were really, really pleased to see that. The announcements themselves, they are something that has that we as Crisis and many others across the sector, and particularly in the domestic abuse sector, have been asking for a long time. So the detail of the announcement is that there will be a change to some of the homelessness legislation. So something called Local Connection will no longer apply to domestic abuse survivors and care leavers, and as I understand it, veterans too. And there is kind of a wider program of work around veterans that is already in place, and I think this builds on that. So we see that as very positive, definitely in the right direction. At Crisis, we are really keen actually to look at the legislation in the long term. Things like Local Connection really do prevent the outcomes that you would hope that system actually is designed to do. And partly it is because we are in such a situation where there's a rationing of social housing effectively. So we're pleased to see priority given to people because they are so disproportionately affected by these laws, and that recognition and understanding of that is critical. But we actually want to see a bit of a wider review of the homelessness legislation in and of itself, and that has to sit alongside social housing delivery. So that's why one of the reasons we're so keen to see social housing prioritised, because it will allow for a very different approach to homelessness being made. So things like local connection may be less of an issue if you actually have the housing that people need. And I know we'll probably touch later on Andy Burnham's comments around housing first philosophy, but that is very much tied into some of this. So we see that those announcements are really a starting point of that philosophy that Andy Burnham has been advocating for, and that comes from Finland. It's a philosophy that we as Crisis have also been talking about for quite a long time, so it'd be great to discuss that more. But the long and short is, very pleased with that. Devil in the detail, as always, but signalling in the right direction, and the recognition that that's coming through is really important.
Thanks very much, and yeah, really interesting. We'll come back to some of that, and housing first, yeah, absolutely, and some of Burnham's statements, but actually some of the collective statements that were coming through. I'm going to move now to a question from Paramveer. Thanks very much for the question. It's encouraging to hear of the considerations around funding and planning. However, I foresee some of the longer term constraints to deliver their housing numbers will be around or is around skilled labour and reliable supply chains. Were there any considerations and plans around these points? I mean, skills, huge issue in the sector. The London Homes Coalition published a really interesting piece of work a few months ago about skills gaps in the sector. I know, and Lucy, I might come to you first, because I know Lucy that actually, in terms of the North East Housing Partnerships prospectus, and indeed Kim McGuinness, who's the North East Mayor, skills and skills gaps very much part of the thinking there, but obviously also part of the problem. So yeah, I'll move to you first, Lucy, with that question.
Thanks. Yeah, so there was a lot of talk about skills at conference generally. I think there was a real understanding of, if you want to achieve the government's missions, and particularly the driving forward economic growth, they really understand that you need to address the skills issues and you need to invest in that. I would say at the housing sessions I was at, I don't feel like skills was a huge topic of conversation. So I don't think it came up a lot in terms of, particularly around construction skills. I think where it did come up was around green skills. And often it came up as an opportunity. So I think, there was quite a lot of talk about how the retrofit and the decarbonisation of homes on a large scale is a huge opportunity in terms of jobs and new skills and reskilling people. When we had the conversations around devolution, I would say it was more of a focus for the Metro mayors, and they were, I think, a bit more understanding of the synergies between housing and skills, and how we need to get both of those right, and how closely they are linked together. So I would say, yes, skills is definitely something that conference was focused on, and I think probably it's down to us as well to kind of keep that conversation going and to kind of drive forward our asks and what we need around that as a sector. And I certainly think that we'll find a willing audience and a willing partner in the Metro mayors to take that issue forward.
Thanks very much, and James, I might come to you next with that question, and also I'll throw in a separate question. Andy Burnham getting a few mentions, so people have been picking up on what he's been saying. This is a slightly different aspect to it. A question from Dave, which is, Andy Burnham has called for the return of mandatory council representation on housing association boards. We're reporting on that this week. Do you think this may be a realistic quid pro quo for increased public investment in affordable social housing, and what might the implications be for the sector, and certainly for a large national landlord that raises quite a lot of questions, I would have thought. So the question about skills, definitely interested in your take on that, James, but also that question about that kind of representation on boards.
Sure. On skills, I mean, similar to Lucy, we see it as critical, and there was a lot of discussion around skills at conference, amongst lots of other things. And I think one thing I sort of tried to convey in my opening was that it was a very, very sort of multivariate conversation that was happening around housing. There was a recognition that it's a complex issue, and that there are a huge range of things that we're going to have to get right to deliver the homes that we all know are needed. And skills was very much part of that. So we want to have it, and even in individual conversations with MPs, some of them were raising how do I get apprenticeships into my constituency? How can I build up the skills base in my constituency? How can we work together with local colleges on increasing that in my constituency? So there is a recognition there around skills and what's needed, and that it is a major challenge alongside others like funding. We're going to have to get all of this right at the same time to deliver the government's ambition, and that is a major task. And certainly, we're up for it. And conversations that I've had with Lucy and I didn't actually bump into each other at the conference, but with others, and I imagine if we did have the conversation, we would agree that we have to get all of these things right at the same time to deliver the homes that we all know are needed, and the quality of homes that are needed, and all of that, which was all part of the conversation at conference. On Andy Burnham's point, I may have been in the room when he made that statement, and I may have afterwards, because he was slightly critical also as another point in that of large housing associations in particular, and I may have stood up and given a bit of a full-throated defence of housing associations after he made that comment, but also after he left the room, sadly, because I didn't get called before that. But we would have to see, how it would work. For us, we operate across a large area. If you were to try and get every local authority that we operated in onto our board, that would be a pretty large board. So I think certainly having really good relationships with local authorities, listening to local authorities, partner with local authorities, like I said, is really, really critical, and we have to hold those relationships with them. And certainly, it's a large part of my job is engaging with our local authorities, because they are critical partners for us. In terms of boards, we would have to see how it would work.
Yeah, it raises big questions, doesn't it? Yeah, thanks very much, James. And the practicalities of it, certainly I'm struggling to get my head around at the minute. But I think that certainly it wasn't talked through exactly how that would work, and some key kind of follow-up questions, I think, from conference. I'm going to take a question from Ian now about funding. And says clearly there's an aspiration to increase housing delivery. To what extent will that objective be backed up by actual funding plans and budgetary commitments? And Priya, I'll come to you on that, and I might add in a little bit of my own as well, because I kind of mentioned. You mentioned partnerships, and that was definitely one of the words that I think before conference and during conference was used by ministers throughout. I mentioned that kind of the pensions minister flagging the partnership between Nest, L&G, PGGM to deliver new homes, and said it highlighted the government's pensions review, which among other things is looking to unlock billions of pounds of investment in the UK economy. So I guess, what did conference tell you about how government's looking to unlock opportunities for investment in the sector, and interested in your thoughts about that review as well? And then that kind of question from Ian about to what extent were you picking up on any indications about whether that's going to be backed up by actual funding plans and budgetary commitments? And obviously we're talking ahead of the budget, which is I guess where it's all hanging on. But Priya, over to you.
It's quite a lot to unpack there, but from my perspective, just to address some of the points around the questions, it was not clear to me that there was going to be a huge amount said at the conference around, given that the budget is where everyone sort of focused on, as I said earlier. So there wasn't, I didn't sense a direct discussion on how they were going to support the sector in sort of real money terms. Just to take sort of the question around delivery, the challenge the sector has, aside from the macroeconomic challenges, namely through heightened interest rate and inflation rates, is that it has multiple competing priorities. So albeit the ambitions are there on delivery, which we welcome because it's needed, equally there are fairly significant, for example, net zero ambitions. So the clients that we serve, namely the housing associations, have those competing priorities to then determine how they prioritize which part of the balance sheet that they need to deliver on. Do they look at investing in existing stock to achieve ultimately net zero ambitions, or is it to facilitate the delivery of new homes, which are all part of the remit of said housing associations? So I think there's a little bit of work that needs to be done, and it's something I raised on a panel, a roundtable I was on with Miata Fanbule, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero Undersecretary of State, as she has a primary focus on net zero, but we also have a focus on delivery of housing. My ask was, can we have the discussion where all of those priorities are joined up on their side, especially on the department side, to ensure that we are looking at it along with them as a collective set of priorities rather than these distinct silos of priorities. And I think that will help with the discussions around sourcing the appropriate private capital needed to deliver those various funding requirements. So there is work to be done to sort of connect the dots, I think, on the public sector side, on the government side, to ensure that we have clear understanding that there are a number of priorities, and that's what's playing on our clients, and hence it's trickier to then understand how best to source the appropriate funding. Equally, I would say that the current model is such that, given we don't have clarity, for example, on long-term rent settlement, the capacity of housing associations from taking on more funding is compromised. There is a need to think about new models and these new partnerships, because we are going to remain in this heightened interest rate and inflation environment, we think. And those alternative funding models need to be as a partnership with the public sector, but housing associations need to do their bit in understanding how they need to improve their position to allow for additional funding to come in. And so the options can vary on that, and we can jump into that. But without answering, I guess, the question of how do we fund it just on the delivery, it needs to be looked in the round with the other priorities as well.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting about that kind of evolving conversation and that need to kind of keep the kind of lobbying effort up, just in terms of those partnerships and in terms of that kind of emerging picture moving forwards. Just for the audience, so could you elaborate on what you think is or what you would hope, perhaps a bit of both, is going to emerge?
So I think that the couple of things, I'd just using net zero as an example, in terms of the need to invest. The role of private capital can be quite significant there, but the investment that it needs to do, say for retrofit or indeed the larger net zero initiatives, the investment needs to be investable. So there is a role for public sector to look at ways to make the proposition investable, and therefore allowing private capital to crowd in. And that's where the partnership needs to come together, is to see how both sectors can come together to deliver that ambition of retrofit and net zero indeed. On a wider point, I would say that this is the way that partnerships come to pass, is we need to see, similar to the way that the pension announcement that you referred to, there is a wall of money there. We know there's a lot of investment that investors that are interested, but the funding options and the models that we need to create need to be more innovative. That could include things like alternative ownership vehicles to allow that funding to go further. Whether that is to split risks between financing the development process, for example, of delivering new stock, versus financing the final product, or when things are operational, when things are built. They could be two distinct pools of funding. There are different pockets of capital that do each part of those processes. Indeed, there might be ways to create joint ventures such that the balance sheet of housing associations are not as compromised. They can essentially do things that perhaps are off balance sheet in those joint ventures that allow them to then create the capacity to continue to do the other priorities that they need to deliver on. So I guess my final thought on that is that we do need to be creative and innovative, look at other sectors for ideas and funding models that might serve the sector well to achieve all of its ambitions. The energy transition piece in itself has a number of areas we can go into that has models that have come to pass that we can lean on to ensure that we can achieve all the objectives and priorities that are needed to achieve all the goals that have been outlined.
Thanks very much, Priya. And I think those models and some of the models we might want to be exploring will also be picking up on the pages of Inside Housing. And I should say a piece of research I think from our sister title Social Housing, looking at the cash reserves among the sector's biggest 200 landlords falling to a 10-year low. So I mean, it kind of brings into perspective some of the things you're saying as well. Or kind of just another part of that. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to a question from James, who's asking about the voices in the room at that conference. So how many tenants and residents, customers who actually live in social housing and their families were there, were in speaking roles, if you like. So how many were on panels? What was that kind of interaction like? And James, I might just start off by saying, because there's a few questions on homelessness, so I'll come to Jasmine very shortly to pick up on some of those. But I know certainly the panel that I was on a Sunday evening had a number of tenants and residents who were taking direct action in their areas and also spoke very passionately about the need for change. So certainly on a number of the panels throughout the week, there were tenants and residents on those panels. I think some of the YIMBY panels later in the week from a slightly different perspective were also talking about that. So Lucy, I might come to you first on that, and then James, because James, I know you were in that YIMBY session, and Lucy, I think you were trying to get into the YIMBY session, but it was so packed that it was a struggle. So Lucy, over to you. The voices in the room were tenants and residents there, because I know certainly you've been involved in initiatives with in your area, which have involved strengthening the tenant voice and in a number of areas. So Lucy, over to you.
Yeah, so I think it was mixed. There were some events, as you said, that definitely had representation from tenants and residents, and I think that they were really positive events. And it always is best when you hear from people about their lived experience and understanding what some of the issues that people are facing and find really difficult. I think what was interesting for me was also the breadth of experience in the audience of people who were residents of or had experience of living in social housing. So there were a lot of people who were able to kind of bring that within the questioning, which I think was really helpful, because it brings it down to quite a tangible nature. And because we can be guilty of talking about long-term strategies and plans and funding and things like this, when actually it's about people having safe and secure and affordable homes. And I think the nature of the discussions did often, come back to that. And particularly residents were able to raise issues around the links between housing and health, and, well-being, and, the importance of having that home as your base in order to be able to do other things. So I think it was certainly live in the discussions I was listening to, but it was a mix in terms of panels and representation.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And James, same question to you. Like I say, I know you're in the YIMBY session, which certainly had representation there. But what was your kind of feeling across the conference as a whole, and how important is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's hugely important, and like Lucy, I think it was mixed. One thing to say on that is that even where echoing Lucy, even where perhaps all the panelists were to professionals as opposed to customers, the room was always full of people who had experience of living in social housing, and could really bring something to discussion in the same way that you are now by asking this question. And in conference, you're often in quite packed rooms, as Martin said. So there'd be quite a lot of people, and you have much more of a discussion perhaps than you do through this format. The other thing to say on that is not to forget that, as I said earlier, a lot of the MPs who are new Labour MPs have experience or have grown up in social housing, so they brought their own experience to that, which I think you perhaps wouldn't get at some other parties' conferences, but you got that experience, and that came through, and often they were sort of representing that on the panel, which is what you actually expect from a member of Parliament.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and actually one I do want to come to very shortly about that kind of experience. But yeah, I think that YIMBY session I was just talking about, certainly the MP there, who I momentarily forget the name of,
Chris Justice.
Thank you very much, was very passionately saying, the government said it's going to deliver this. Obviously, he's part of it, but the government said it's going to deliver this. I'm going to be part of that kind of group of people, making sure it follows through, because I know what this means. This is me in my life. So absolutely, there was that kind of mix in there as well, and very different, I think, from even 10 or so years ago at Labour Party conferences. Much more of a feeling for me anyway, that there were people who had very direct experiences of living in the sector, struggles to gain access to affordable housing, generation of MPs coming through who are wanting to talk about that, and we want to talk about that very, very directly. So yeah, interesting to reflect on a number of ways that kind of happens. Right, there have been a few conversations coming through about homelessness, and also the right to buy. A question from Sheila. I'll just take on that. Which do you think we've made any ground on the key issues of funding for social housing delivery? So again, that 90,000 homes you were talking about earlier, Jasmine, and the weakening of the impact of right to buy. A bit more on the funding, but there was a progress. And then a question from Vanessa, saying, specifically for you, Jasmine, the percentage of ill mental health and addiction is very high in social housing. Will Labour be helping to deal with the shocking fact, and are there any new policies to assist this issue? So yeah, I mean, I think that was something that was talked about in the opening session a bit when I was there. Jasmine, a couple of questions for you to pick up on.
Yeah, thank you. On funding, I think many in the panel have touched on this already. I think it's still very much an open conversation. So on the first night, the Labour Housing Group event that Martin's mentioned and that we both spoke at, the Minister was very, very clear, I think, on the case for social housing delivery and why it's needed, but did caveat with, things are worse than expected in this space, and there's a big kind of fight to be had, I guess, on how some of this happens. He did not use the word fight. That is my interpretation of it. But I think what that signals is there's a lot more to do in terms of how they're working through how to deliver on the ambition of this, but certainly not curtailing the ambition. And as a campaigning organisation, we feel it's quite useful to continue pushing on kind of those bigger targets around social housing and really making that economic case to help cut through kind of across government, because it might be that the MHCLG is very strong on this, but it needs to link in with Treasury and wider plans around this. So it feels like there's a lot more to discuss. The right to buy was very interesting. There were a number of interesting discussions on this. So I was at a panel event with the Chartered Institute of Housing, where they were presenting a report that was led by Southwark Council on the case for kind of council housing. And even within that panel, which was an absolutely brilliant panel, you had a differing view on the right to buy. So some were calling for abolishing it, others were calling for kind of the discounts or kind of a slightly different way. But I think the overall consensus is there needs to be a change from where we are now. It needs to be that local authorities can have more discretion and more power over how the right to buy is used, because it is such a kind of significant factor in the loss of social housing stock. And I feel that that's a significant shift in terms of a national government entertaining that. And of course, they've committed to consulting specifically on right to buy, so they will be getting people's views. On the issue of ill health, ill mental health and other kind of associated support needs around homelessness, this is a really key one for us. So I think the one thing for me that there was a lack of in Fringes and in the conference in general was the other side of the coin to housing in relation to homelessness, and that is the support side of it. So actually we know there are a lot of people who are currently homeless, living in temporary accommodation or overcrowding or possibly sofa surfing, who their solution is just going to be housing. They need affordable, decent homes, and actually that will resolve their homelessness. But there are others who have developed support needs or who have quite severe support needs that are kind of linked into homelessness, because homelessness is incredibly traumatic and people can develop support needs when they are homeless. And so that side of the argument of what are we doing to actually help people, how are we supporting people, I feel is still not quite there. We are very much focused in on the housing element at the moment because that's where the conversation is, and also that's where we see kind of such a blocker on the ground when we're delivering our services, because our ethos is all around, if you secure a stable home for someone first, they are much more able to engage in support services and then access kind of help and, you know, move on from the trauma of homelessness. If you're trying to do that while they're still homeless and living in very difficult circumstances, those support services find it really hard to actually make progress with people. So that's very much where we as an organisation want to have that next conversation, and where we see the opportunity for that is Angela Rayner will be chairing an interministerial group to deliver a strategy on homelessness. And that feels like a really clear signal of recognition from the government that this isn't kind of MHCLG's job alone. It has to work with other departments. We would see health as a really, really important component of that, and this is something we've been advocating for a long time, to genuinely get senior representation across governments to really understand where the issues they might be seeing in their departments is linked to housing and homelessness. We can't forget that actually there's a significant impact on the NHS because of poor quality housing and because of homelessness. So we see that kind of interministerial group as the first step towards this, and we're really looking forward to seeing some kind of the government plans around some of this and how they're looking to engage, and particularly with people with lived experience as well.
Thanks so much. So yeah, that's a really important you kind of watch this space to flag, but actually an indication of that kind of better working together, less siloed approach. A question which I'll throw in just as we go. James, I might come to you next, but just basically has qualifications in housing fallen by the wayside. And I should say, or is it kind of being put back? Certainly that was talked about this week. It was on panels, so it didn't feel to me like that was disappearing into the distance. It felt very much like it was an indication it is coming. That was a quite strong one, I think. I think Penny Cook was talking about it on a panel I was at earlier this week. Yeah, certainly seems to be in. But just to round off very quickly, so quite quick answers on this, but there did feel like, as we were saying at the start, this kind of mood music, MP after MP talking about social housing, a lot of them talking about their own experiences, some of them like Andrew Lewin, who won well in Hatfield, Jennifer Riddell Carpenter, I think it's David Smith up in Northumberland with sector work experience, if you like. They've worked in the sector, they know how it operates as well, so they've got the kind of technical knowledge they're coming to the sector with. So how important is it, and what should a kind of partnership look like there? And I'm sorry, a relatively quick answer, James, if that's okay. What should that kind of partnership look like? How can the sector take advantage?
So partnerships with MPs. I mean, I certainly, and it's not just Labour. I would say that there are others in other parties who have that experience. Certainly, Lee Dillon and Gideon Amos for Liberal Democrats as well also have that experience from the sector. We do need to capitalise on it, and I know that my chief executive appeared on a panel with Andrew, and I think we need to have those voices consistently throughout government. And making the argument, particularly to Treasury, around money, and actually, as Jasmine said, that cross-departmental, cross-governmental point is so important, because, as I alluded to earlier, we're not going to solve this just if MHCLG tries to do its thing. It has to be a cohesive piece across government. Is the only way that we're going to unpick this and deliver the homes that we actually know need to be delivered for the people who need them.
Thanks very much. And Lucy, just some very quick last thoughts, but I just think that's really interesting how you're looking to maximise those opportunities as well, because it feels like quite a big one for the sector.
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity. One, you don't have to, there's a shorthand there, they understand the issues, they're already supportive, you don't have to do that initial kind of getting their buy-in. I think I would like to see us creating a real coalition of the willing, a coalition of people who have that knowledge and support. And that's something we can do as housing partnerships. I know we're looking at the Northeast as the Northeast Housing Partnership to use, those as kind of champions of housing within Parliament. And I think that can only be a good thing for us as a sector.
Thanks very much. I think that's a great point to bring things to a close. Champions of housing, and there may well be a decent number of them in the Labour Party now who have kind of either lived experience or working experience within the sector, and I think that's an opportunity that really we need to think about very seriously. So thank you. We are out of time. That hour has whisked by. There were loads more. Apologies if I didn't get to your questions, because there were loads more. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope we covered a decent cross section of your questions and gave you a flavour of conference for those of you who weren't there. So thank you for tuning in, and it remains for me to thank our panel as well for a really great debate and discussion, and reliving the last 4 days. So I'll let them go and rest their hoarse voices now. But thank you all very much for your contributions. They really enjoyed it, and a really important discussion, I think. Thank you.